Taldain is, without a doubt, one of the most unusual planets in the Cosmere. Tidally locked between a blue-white supergiant and a white dwarf, one half of the planet is perpetually bathed in bright sunlight, while the other half remains in a twilight haze. It's also a planet that a lot of Cosmere fans aren't very familiar with because the only books set on it are the White Sands graphic novels, which, if we're being honest, a lot of Cosmere fans just skip entirely. But Taldain differs from other Cosmere planets more than just in being tidally locked. I think we have good reason to believe it will have a massive impact on the future of the Cosmere, and I even personally think it could wind up being one of the greatest threats to galaxy-wide peace in the forthcoming Space Age era. Before we go on, a note about spoilers. I'll be avoiding specific plot spoilers for all of the Cosmere books, except for very vague details about the first volume of White Sand. But I will be talking about general world-building stuff, so if you're the sort of person who's really paranoid about any sort of spoilers, then this might not be the right video for you. So one of the things that makes the White Sand books so interesting, aside from the way they're usually maligned by fans, is when they're set in the Cosmere timeline. In-universe, they take place long before any of the other Cosmere books, even hundreds of years before Mistborn Era 1 and Elantris. And perhaps that's somewhat appropriate considering that it was the first book that Brandon Sanderson ever wrote, period. But it raises some interesting implications about the future of the series going forward. In the graphic novels, we see that despite being set at a very early point in the Cosmere timeline, Taldain has a very technologically advanced society. On the dark side of the planet, a thriving empire has invented scientific instruments and gunpowder, and produces rich textiles among other goods, and even on the day side of the planet, which is largely dominated by inhospitable deserts, we see that cities are sprouting up in oases that have a level of technology and culture similar to the early modern Middle East or Europe. What this implies is that if Taldain experiences an industrial revolution shortly after the events of White Sand, by the current point in the Cosmere, we should be expecting Taldain to have accomplished feats like human spaceflight and computers and things we can't even imagine. Now, before I get into the implications of that, we have to at least examine how likely it would be for Taldain to undergo such an industrial revolution. Because despite what a lot of people think, the Industrial Revolution as we experienced it on Earth was not an inevitable event by any means. And because it only happened once, it's really hard to estimate the likelihood that any given planet will experience an Industrial Revolution. So I apologize in advance because I'm about to go really deep into this, but I think this stuff is really interesting, so just bear with me. Our Industrial Revolution was due to a combination of lots of factors that were actually very specific to England in the early 18th century. For example, if most of Great Britain hadn't been deforested by the early 18th century, England might never have gotten around to using coal for power instead of wood and charcoal. Or if England hadn't had coal reserves that were close enough to the surface that they could be mined, but deep enough that they couldn't manually be pumped free of water, then the steam engine, which was originally used for that express purpose of pumping water out of coal mines, might never have been invented. Or, if England hadn't been such a major producer of textiles at that point in history, which was largely helped by its colonialism in India, then a use for steam power outside of coal mining might never have been discovered. Now, unfortunately, we don't have access to detailed information about coal reserves and deforestation on the dark side of Taldain, but there are some things in the graphic novels that make me think that the planet is actually on the verge of an industrial revolution. One is that it's pretty clear that the dark side of the planet actually has gone through a scientific revolution, as evidenced by characters like Chris, who spend time studying the natural world and who push back against superstition with rationality, all of which make an industrial revolution seem much more likely. But the second thing, of course, is that this is the Cosmere, which means there's magic. And even though Chris and the other Darksiders seem initially shocked upon learning about sand mastery and White Sand, now that those two sides of the planet are interacting, it's only a matter of time before somebody figures out how to commodify that form of investiture and create magical devices similar to Fabriel's on Roshar. That would obviously make an industrial revolution more likely, or even be an industrial revolution onto itself. All of which is my incredibly long-winded way of saying that yes, it does seem extremely likely that Taldain has gone through an industrial revolution, and that at this point in the Cosmere, the time period in which the Stormlight Archive and Mistborn Era 2 takes place, it's likely incredibly technologically advanced. While we don't know exact dates, it's likely something like 1,000 years passed between White Sand and the Stormlight Archive, which gives Taldain plenty of time to have discovered space exploration and colonized other worlds. But that leads us to a sort of Cosmere Fermi paradox. Because if they are such a technologically advanced society, why haven't they taken to the stars yet? Where are they? What are they doing? And the answer is, of course, Autonomy. Autonomy, or Bavadine, as she is otherwise known, is the shard of Taldain and a strict isolationist. Hundreds of years ago, after the events of White Sand, she sealed Taldain off from the rest of the Cosmere, so that even characters who are originally from Taldain, like Chris, are not able to visit their home planet. Now, we really don't know a whole lot about Autonomy or what her goals are, but one thing we do know is that despite being very trepidatious about interfering in the affairs of other shards, she has influence all over the Cosmere. By creating avatars of herself and sending them to other planets, Bavadine has not only a network of spies to inform her about the goings-on on other planets, but also a way of interfering with the events on other planets and shaping them to suit her goals. But the question is then, what are her goals? We know that she wants to fulfill her intent, which is obviously to remain autonomous. But that's not really a goal. Bavadine is a person, not just a mindless force, which means that she has goals and desires, and probably means that her interference on other planets and her isolationism are really just manifestations of some higher level goal. So here's my line of thought. In order to prevent the incredibly technologically advanced civilizations of Taldain from pursuing space exploration, Bavadine would have to take direct actions to stop them from doing so. This probably means that the inhabitants of Taldain are very aware of her existence, in a way that your average Joe on most shard worlds are not aware of their own shards. And given what we know about the limited power of most shards, she would have to have some way of enforcing her blockade of the planet, which, although this is total speculation, could potentially be done with a powerful military force armed with sand mastery or with some other weapon. All of which is to say that Taldain could very easily at this point in the Cosmere be a technologically advanced but strictly authoritarian planet-wide state, ruled by Autonomy herself, a sort of Cosmere North Korea, if you will. Now there is another possibility, which is that Autonomy might have slowly crippled the civilizations on her planet to prevent them from even thinking about space exploration as a possibility, and thus eliminating the need to directly control her civilizations. There's even a word of Brandon that seems to suggest she might have done something like this, although Brandon didn't go so far as to confirm that Taldain has actually suffered a major technological cataclysm of the sort that would cripple their planet truly. But if she did pursue this strategy, there would be a major downside. Autonomy knows that other civilizations on other planets will eventually develop spaceflight, and at that point it will be incredibly hard for her to stay isolated, particularly if she's crippled the people of her planet technologically. So it might turn out that the best way for her to fulfill her intent will be to work with the people of Taldain rather than against them, bolstering her border security in Shadesmar and eventually in the physical realm. So here's the big takeaway. At this point in the history of the Cosmere, I think that Taldain is like a powder keg about to explode. It's likely that they had a technological revolution hundreds or even 1,000 years ago, and even if progress hasn't been quite exponential since then, the civilizations on the planet exist at a very high technological equilibrium. So we can imagine the people of Taldain working with Autonomy and making scientific breakthrough after scientific breakthrough, but consciously making the decision not to push out and explore space. Meanwhile, Autonomy with their avatars on other planets is watching and waiting and keeping a close eye on all shards that might be the biggest threat to her intent. Shards like Odium. Then, when the time is right, perhaps when Odium is no longer a threat to her, we can imagine Taldain with all its latent potential exploding out into the Cosmere. With its major technological advantages kept secret even from world hoppers all this time, it has the potential to dominate other shard worlds. And maybe it will be at that point, and only at that point, that we'll find out what Autonomy's true intentions really are. So this theory might be totally off the rails, but I still think it's fun to think about, particularly now that I'm getting around to reading White Sand. That one word of Brandon I mentioned earlier does potentially pose a problem for it, but I still think that a key takeaway is that Taldain is likely to be much more important in the future of the Cosmere than most of us expect. And if that's the case, then maybe we should all get around to reading White Sand. As a side note, I'm currently reading the White Sand graphic novels for the first time, and they're fine. The pacing is a little weird. It's sort of like reading a Cosmere book on fast forward. But I think the seeds of a great story are there, and I'm excited to see a potential prose adaptation in the future. But anyway, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. And I know this is my first real theory video and slightly more in depth than anything I've done before. So let me know if this is the sort of content you guys like to see, and let me know what you think of the theory. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay generic. That still sounds like such a terrible catchphrase.